Big Shaq never backed down from a challenge, but saving a pregnant police officer on the run from her own corrupt department. That put a target on his back. Framed, hunted, and betrayed, the legend of Big Shaq was now caught in a game designed to erase him. But when the truth is more dangerous than the lies, there's only one way out. Fight back. And they should have known. Legends don't go down without a fight. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The world saw Big Shaq as a legend, a 7-foot powerhouse who once dominated the courts, a larger-than-life personality who cracked jokes on live TV, a multi-millionaire businessman with endorsements worth more than some countries' economies. But behind the cameras, behind the laughter, behind the towering fame, there was a man who saw the world differently. For all his wealth and success, Shaquille O'Neal knew one truth that never changed. Money couldn't buy a different skin. It didn't matter how many checks he wrote for charity, how many scholarships he funded, or how many small businesses he saved from going under. To some people, he was still just a big black man taking up too much space. But Shaq had never been one to complain. He let his actions speak louder than his words. He built, he gave, he uplifted. And in return, the people loved him. Kids from struggling neighborhoods lined up outside his foundation, hoping for just one word of advice from their hero. Families who had lost everything found a second chance through his silent donations. And when he walked into a room, he was impossible to ignore. Not just because of his size, but because of his heart. That was the Shaq the world saw. And yet, in recent weeks, something had changed. Something dark, something quiet, something watching. It started subtly. A black SUV parked across the street from his downtown office. Not unusual in a city like Los Angeles, where tinted windows and oversized egos were as common as the traffic. But it was the same SUV, parked in different places, always close by, always just out of reach. Then came the glitches. His phone calls dropping in the middle of conversations, his emails bouncing back as undeliverable, his security system notifying him of failed login attempts he never made. At first, he brushed it off as paranoia. Tech issues happened, and being famous meant people were always looking for dirt to dig up. But then his head of security, Reggie Coleman, pulled him aside. "Shaq, we got a problem." Reggie wasn't the type to panic. A former military man turned private security expert, he was the kind of guy who could stay calm in an earthquake. So when Reggie looked worried, Shaq paid attention. "There's been unusual surveillance on you. Someone's running background checks trying to access old files. Your name's been flagged in places it shouldn't be." Shaq frowned. "Like what places?" Reggie exhaled, hesitant. "Law enforcement databases, private investigator networks. Someone's looking for something. Or they're trying to make it look like you're hiding something." Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And who exactly is someone?" Reggie shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to find out. But whoever it is, they're careful. No digital footprints, no paper trail. And that SUV?" He paused. "It's not random." Shaq stayed silent. He had dealt with reporters, paparazzi, and scandal hunters before. This felt different. This felt personal. One evening, after a long meeting at his foundation's headquarters, Shaq stepped into the dimly lit parking lot, his mind occupied with a funding proposal he had been reviewing. And then he felt it. That instinct, the one that had saved him more times than he could count on the court. The awareness of someone watching. He didn't turn his head immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, grabbing his phone and pretending to check a message. But his eyes flicked to the side, scanning the parked cars. There it was. The black SUV. No headlights, no movement. Just sitting there, its engine humming so quietly it was almost drowned out by the distant hum of the city. Shaq exhaled, forcing himself to relax. If someone wanted to spook him, they were going to have to try harder than that. But then, as he stepped toward his car, the SUV's headlights suddenly flashed. Once, twice, then darkness again. Shaq stood still, gripping his phone, waiting for something, anything. But nothing came. No one stepped out. No window rolled down. The SUV just sat there, silent, its message delivered in the most cryptic way possible. Shaq's jaw tightened. He had spent his life playing against some of the best strategists in the world. This question mark. This was a mind game, and he wasn't about to lose. Back at his mansion, he found Reggie waiting, arms crossed, face unreadable. "I saw it again," Shaq said as he closed the door behind him. "They flashed their damn lights at me this time." Reggie nodded. "Yeah. And while you were at your meeting, someone tried accessing your bank records. Whoever they are, they're not just watching, they're searching for something." Shaq exhaled, his patience wearing thin. "Then let's cut the crap. Who do you think it is?" Reggie hesitated before answering. "I don't think this is about your businesses or your money." He met Shaq's gaze. "I think this is about your past." A heavy silence filled the room. Shaq didn't have skeletons in his closet, but he did have a past. And in America, being a black man in power often meant someone, somewhere, would try to rewrite your story. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Not because he was scared. Big Shaq wasn't the type to get scared, but because for the first time in years, he didn't know who he was up against. The next morning, he decided he was done playing defense. He called in a favor from an old contact, a retired detective who owed him one. "Do some digging," Shaq told him. "Find out who's looking for me, and why." The detective chuckled. "You finally got yourself into some trouble, huh?" Shaq's voice was steady. Not yet. But something told him trouble was coming. And it wasn't just going to knock on his door. It was already inside the house. The city was alive, but Shaq was drowning in silence. The noise of the world, honking horns, distant sirens, the hum of late-night traffic, felt like nothing more than background static. His mind was elsewhere, still tangled in the web of the past few weeks. The black SUV, the flashing headlights, the quiet message buried beneath layers of paranoia. Tonight, he had left the office later than usual. His security had offered to drive him, but Shaq had waved them off. He needed space. He needed to breathe. The streets grew emptier as he cut through a quieter part of the city. A shortcut he often took when he wanted to avoid the bright lights and watchful eyes of downtown. But as he neared a dimly lit intersection, something made him tap the brakes. A sound, sharp, desperate, cut through the night air. A scream. Shaq's grip tightened on the wheel. He turned his head toward the source of the noise, an alleyway between two rundown buildings, the kind of place where things happened in the dark that no one ever talked about. And then he saw her. A woman, staggering into the alley's flickering light. She was clutching her side, her uniform torn, dark stains spreading across the fabric. A police officer, and she was pregnant. Shaq barely had time to process what was happening before movement in the shadows caught his eye. 3 figures, dressed in dark clothing, masks covering their faces, closing in on her. A robbery? A revenge attack? Number something about this felt different. Shaq wasn't the type to hesitate, but this wasn't a situation where he could just charge in. He had learned long ago that strength wasn't just in size, it was in control. So he stayed in the car, watching, calculating. The woman turned sharply, her back against the wall, her free hand reaching for her holster, empty. She was cornered, outnumbered, and unarmed. Shaq's pulse quickened. He had seen enough. He killed the engine, stepping out slowly, his massive frame emerging from the darkness. The streetlight cast long shadows, making him look even bigger. "Yo," he called out casually, like he had just stumbled onto an awkward conversation. "Everything good here?" The 3 men froze. One of them glanced back at him, eyes narrowing behind his mask. "Move along," the man said, voice low, controlled. Shaq took a step closer. "Nah, see, I got a problem with that." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Because from where I'm standing, looks like you're about to do something real stupid." The tallest of the 3 turned fully toward him now, taking in the size difference. "This ain't your business." Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "See, that's where you're wrong, because I'm making it my business." The woman, still clutching her side, took the distraction as an opportunity. She moved, not away, but toward them, toward Shaq. She recognized something in him. Maybe the way he carried himself. Maybe the fact that he wasn't afraid. The moment she stepped toward him, the lead man snapped, "Grab her." Shaq didn't move. He didn't have to. He was playing a different game. "You sure you want to do that?" His voice was almost lazy, like he was still debating whether or not this was worth his time. The hesitation was just long enough. The woman's hand darted into her jacket pocket, pulling out something small and metallic. She tossed it toward Shaq. Instinctively, he caught it. A badge. Shaq barely had time to register it before she spoke, her voice low but urgent. "They're cops." A silence settled over the alley, thick and suffocating. The kind of silence that came right before the world changed. Shaq looked down at the badge in his hand, then back up at the men in front of him. The lead man's jaw clenched. The moment stretched. A quiet game of chicken. Would they go through with it? Would they attack now? Knowing Shaq wasn't just a witness, but someone who could expose them? Shaq tilted his head slightly. Well, that just got interesting. The second man, the one to the left, shifted uneasily. He wasn't built for this. He wasn't built for uncertainty. Shaq saw the crack and pushed harder. "So let's think this through," he continued, turning the badge over in his hand like it was a playing card. "I call the real cops and you explain why you're jumping one of their own. Or you walk away." The lead man's fists clenched. Shaq could almost hear his teeth grinding. For a second, Shaq thought the man might actually go for it. Might actually try something. But then the second guy muttered, "This is messed up, man." That was all it took. The tension snapped. "Let's go," the lead man finally said, his voice laced with fury. "Now!" And just like that, they were gone. Silent, fast, and practiced. Not the kind of men who panicked, but the kind who knew when they had lost. Shaq didn't watch them leave. His focus was on the woman in front of him. She was pale, swaying on her feet. Whatever injury she had, it was bad. Shaq stepped forward just as she started to collapse. "I got you," he said, catching her before she hit the ground. She gripped his arm, her breath shaky. Up close, Shaq could see the fear in her eyes. Not just fear, certainty. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They'll come for you too." Then, before Shaq could ask what she meant, she went limp. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it was. Shaq wasn't reckless. He didn't speed, didn't draw attention. But his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they should have. His mind replayed everything. The way those men had moved, how quick they were to leave, the way she had looked at him like he was next. The moment he pulled up to the emergency entrance, hospital staff rushed toward them. As they wheeled her away, a nurse looked back at him. "You family?" Shaq hesitated. "No," he said finally. "Just someone who was in the right place at the wrong time." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. Because this was just the beginning. Shaq had seen a lot in his life. Championships, betrayals, the ruthless machine of the media. But this was different. This wasn't a game, and the stakes weren't measured in wins or losses. Jessica Calloway had nearly died in his arms last night. A pregnant cop, bleeding, terrified, whispering words that still echoed in his mind. "They're everywhere. They'll come for you too." Now, less than 12 hours later, she was gone. The morning had started with Shaq pacing the hospital's private waiting room, restless, his mind running through every possibility. The doctors had taken Jessica into surgery as soon as they arrived. She had lost a lot of blood, but they had assured him she was stable. So how the hell had she disappeared? Shaq stood at the nurse's station, his presence too large to ignore. "Tell me again," he said, voice low, controlled. "How does a pregnant woman recovering from surgery just vanish?" The nurse, mid-40s, tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we checked the footage. There's no sign of her leaving through the front or back entrances. No one signed her out. One of our doctors even checked on her around 5 this morning. And then," she swallowed. "She was just gone." Shaq didn't respond right away. His instincts told him this wasn't incompetence. This was deliberate. Someone had taken her, Shaq stormed out of the hospital, his mind already working ahead. He needed information. He needed to understand who she was, what she knew, and why someone wanted her erased. Back at his penthouse, he sat down in front of his laptop and typed in her name. Jessica Calloway. The results were underwhelming. No articles, no high-profile cases, just a standard department bio and a few scattered mentions in community policing reports. It was as if she barely existed, which meant she had been careful. Shaq wasn't a tech genius, but he knew people who were. He grabbed his phone and dialed an old friend. Nathan Carter had been one of the best cybersecurity analysts in the country before he quit his high-level government job for reasons he never fully explained. Shaq had met him years ago, during a charity event, and their unlikely friendship had lasted ever since. When Nathan picked up, there was no greeting. Just a quiet, amused, "You only call me when something's on fire, Shaq." Shaq didn't waste time. "I need a deep dive. A cop named Jessica Calloway, LAPD, pregnant, missing." There was silence on the other end, then a low whistle. "That's a hell of a combination. You find anything?" "I'll look, but wait." Nathan's tone shifted. "You said LAPD?" Shaq frowned. "Yeah, why?" Nathan exhaled sharply. "Because someone else is already looking for her." Shaq sat up. "Who?" Nathan hesitated. Then, in a voice tight with something Shaq couldn't quite place, he said, "The FBI." 15 minutes later, Shaq was staring at his phone like it might explode. The FBI. Not internal affairs, not another department, but federal agents. Whatever Jessica had gotten herself into, it wasn't just local. This was big. And then, as if the universe was making sure he understood just how deep he was in, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Shaq debated ignoring it, but something told him he already knew who it was. He answered. "Mr. O'Neill," a male voice said, professional but firm. "We need to talk." Shaq leaned back in his chair. "I was wondering when you'd call." The voice didn't react. "We know you were with Jessica Calloway last night. Noticed that, did you? We also know she's missing." Shaq's fingers drummed against the desk. "And what exactly do you think I have to do with that?" A pause. Then, "Not sure yet. But if she contacts you, if you find anything at all, you need to call us immediately." Shaq smirked. "Yeah? And why would I do that?" The voice was quiet for a moment, then colder. "Because if you don't, you might not like what happens next." The call ended. Shaq set his phone down carefully. So that's how it was going to be. Shaq didn't like being threatened. He also didn't like being watched. And right now, he knew both were happening. He stood up, moving toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. Outside, the city sprawled out beneath him, glittering with artificial life. But down on the street, parked just where he could see it if he knew to look, was a black SUV. Not the same one from before, but the same message. He exhaled. They were pushing him, testing him, waiting to see what he'd do. Shaq turned away from the window. If they wanted to watch, let them. He had work to do. Nathan called back an hour later. "Got something." Shaq sat down. "Talk to me." Calloway wasn't just investigating her department. She was investigating her own boss. Shaq's jaw tightened. LAPD brass? Higher. A task force commander named William Tate. Shaq didn't recognize the name. Why him? Because he's dirty. And I don't mean taking bribes. I mean deep, missing evidence, ties to certain businessmen in the city, cases that disappear. Nathan exhaled. And Calloway was getting close. Shaq processed that. So they took her out before she could finish? That's what it looks like. Silence stretched between them. Then Nathan said, "But that's not the worst part." Shaq leaned forward. "What is?" Nathan hesitated. Then, "While I was looking, someone was looking for you." Shaq's stomach dropped. "Say that again?" "Your name's been flagged. Someone's digging through your bank accounts, your real estate, even your foundation's records." Nathan's voice was serious now. "And not just anyone." Shaq exhaled, already knowing the answer. "The FBI?" Nathan's voice was low. Worse. Whoever it is, they're off the books. A slow, cold realization settled in Shaq's chest. This wasn't just about Jessica anymore. This was about him, too. He hung up without another word. Shaq sat in silence for a long time. Everything in him told him to walk away. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't an investigator. He had a good life, good businesses, a reputation worth more than any of this. But he had also looked Jessica Calloway in the eyes last night. He had seen her fear. He had felt the weight of her words. They're everywhere. They'll come for you too. Maybe she had been warning him. Or maybe she had been telling him he was already in it. Shaq closed his laptop and stood up. He had a decision to make. And walking away had never really been an option. Shaq had seen his name in headlines before. Championship wins, business deals, charity work. He knew how the media worked, how they built you up only to tear you down when it suited them. But this was different. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Texts, missed calls, news alerts. His name was everywhere, and for all the wrong reasons. Former NBA star involved in LAPD scandal. Shaquille O'Neal linked to missing pregnant officer. What is he hiding? Jessica Calloway's disappearance raises questions. Was the basketball legend the last to see her? Shaq sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the screen in disbelief. It was happening. They weren't just watching him anymore. They were coming for him. By mid-morning, the story had already spiraled out of control. News anchors dissected his movements, talking heads debated his character, and social media was split between those who defended him and those who didn't. The worst part? He hadn't even said a word yet. Shaq's agent, Derek Wolf, was the first person to get through to him. His voice was shaky, urgent. Shaq, tell me you're watching the news. I'm watching. Tell me this isn't true. Shaq's jaw tightened. I don't even know what this is, Derek. His agent exhaled hard. You know exactly what I mean. Jessica Calloway, the pregnant cop. You were seen with her last night and now she's missing. They're saying I did something to her. Shaq finished for him. A pause. Then Derek's voice dropped. Look, man, I need to know if I should be worried. Shaq clenched his fists. You think I had something to do with this? I think, Derek said carefully, that perception is more powerful than truth. And right now, the perception is bad. Silence stretched between them. Then Derek sighed. I'm getting calls from sponsors, from executives. People are nervous. They want to know what your statement is. Shaq's voice was low. My statement? Yeah, Derek said. Before they decide whether or not they should drop you. The first company pulled out an hour later. Then another. And another. By noon, the board of his foundation had called an emergency meeting. By 1, his business partner in a new restaurant project had suddenly gone in a different direction. By 3, a major endorsement deal had been paused for review. By 5, Shaq wasn't just a retired athlete caught in a scandal. He was a liability. And the worst part? The people who had once sworn they were in his corner, the ones who called him family when the cameras were rolling, weren't returning his calls. Shaq sat alone in his penthouse, staring at his phone. The screen was full of missed calls, messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. Some offering support, most fishing for a story. His lawyers had already advised him not to make a statement yet. Let's wait for more information, they had said. Let's not escalate things. But Shaq knew better. Silence wasn't protection. It was a trap. His phone rang again. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Mr. O'Neal. The voice was calm. Too calm. We need to talk. Shaq exhaled. FBI? A pause. Then, Detective Daniel Hawthorne. LAPD Internal Affairs. Shaq didn't react. And what exactly does IA want with me? You were the last person to see Jessica Calloway before she vanished. We have some questions. Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline. I'll bet you do. He met with Detective Hawthorne later that evening at a discreet office building. Not a police station, not anywhere official. Just neutral ground. Hawthorne was mid-40s, graying at the temples, eyes sharp but tired. The kind of cop who had seen too much and trusted too little. You understand why we called you in, right? Hawthorne asked as he settled across from Shaq. Shaq folded his arms. Because I saved a woman's life last night, and now you think I had something to do with her disappearance? Hawthorne studied him. We don't think anything yet. But let's start with the basics. How did you come across Officer Calloway? Shaq told him everything. The alley, the masked men, the badge, the whisper that still haunted him. Hawthorne didn't interrupt. But when Shaq was done, the detective sat back and said, "That's a hell of a story." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "You don't believe me." "I didn't say that." Hawthorne leaned forward. "But I will say this. Jessica Calloway was digging into something big, and now, so are you." Shaq didn't blink. "Is that a threat?" Hawthorne exhaled. "Number, it's a warning." He slid something across the table, a printed email. Shaq picked it up. The subject line was simple. Case closed. The sender? Jessica Calloway. The timestamp? 4 hours ago. Shaq's pulse slowed. "That's impossible," he said. "Jessica didn't send this." Hawthorne nodded. "You see the problem. Someone was covering their tracks. Someone was making sure Jessica Calloway never existed. And now, they were making sure Shaq went down for it." By the time Shaq left the meeting, the weight of what was happening was starting to settle in. This wasn't just about a missing woman anymore. Someone had planned this. Carefully. Deliberately. And if they were willing to erase Jessica from the system, if they were willing to fabricate evidence against Shaq, then there was only one question left. How far were they willing to go? The next morning, Shaq woke to a knock on his door. Not a normal knock. A police knock. He opened it to find 2 uniformed officers standing there, badges visible, expressions unreadable. "Mr. O'Neill," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." Shaq stared at them. And then, for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be truly trapped. Shaq sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the glass of water in his hand. It was past midnight, but he wasn't tired. He couldn't be. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford when his entire life was crumbling around him. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a free man. Now he was out on bail, charged with obstruction of justice and interfering with a police investigation. The LAPD had made it clear. He was a suspect. And the worst part? He still didn't know why. There were too many moving pieces. Too many lies. Jessica Calloway had been digging into something. The FBI was sniffing around. Someone had erased her from the system. And now they were trying to bury Shaq with her. And when you were a black man accused of bringing down cops, the rules didn't work in your favor. Shaq picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There was only one name he could turn to. Devin Brooks. Devin had been Shaq's closest friend since childhood. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, played ball together on the same cracked asphalt courts. But while Shaq had taken the path of basketball, Devin had taken the path of law. Now, he was one of the top defense attorneys in Los Angeles. Sharp, ruthless, and untouchable. If there was anyone who could help him, it was Devin. Shaq called once. No answer. He called again. Finally, Devin picked up. His voice was calm, steady. Too steady. "You shouldn't have called me," Devin said. Shaq frowned. What the hell does that mean? A pause. Then Devin sighed. "Meet me at my office, not a second later than 2 a.m. Then he hung up. Devin's office was in a high-rise downtown, a place built for people who dealt in secrets. When Shaq arrived, Devin was already sitting at his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, as if he had been expecting this conversation for a long time. "You're playing a game where the rules don't apply to men like us," Devin said the moment Shaq sat down. His voice was low, tired. Shaq leaned forward. "And what the hell is that supposed to mean?" Devin rubbed a hand over his face. "It means you need to walk away." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "Walk away from what?" "From this. From whatever the hell you've stepped into." Devin gestured at the headlines flashing across his computer screen. Shaq's face was everywhere. FBI interested in O'Neill as investigation deepens. Former NBA star at center of police cover-up? What is Shaq hiding? Shaq clenched his fists. "I didn't step into anything. This was thrown at me." Devin exhaled. It doesn't matter. You think truth is gonna save you? You think facts matter? You're fighting ghosts, Shaq. People who don't exist. Shaq studied his friend carefully. Something was wrong. Devin was nervous. And Devin Brooks never got nervous. Shaq sat back. You know something. Devin's jaw tightened. I know that people who go looking for answers in this city end up in places they don't come back from. Shaq shook his head. You're not answering the question. Devin hesitated. Then for the first time he looked away. That's when Shaq knew. You're in on it. Devin's eyes snapped back to his. Don't say that. Shaq's stomach twisted. He had known Devin since they were kids. Trusted him like a brother. Now for the first time, he saw him as something else. Complicit. Devin's voice dropped lower. You don't know what you're dealing with. Then tell me. Silence. Then Devin leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. Jessica wasn't the first. Shaq's pulse slowed. What? Devin exhaled sharply, looking toward the door as if expecting someone to barge in. Jessica wasn't the first cop to dig too deep. There was another, a detective named Eric Dawson. He tried to expose the same thing Jessica was working on. Shaq frowned. Tried? Devin met his gaze. He disappeared 3 years ago. They said it was suicide. They lied. Shaq sat in his car, gripping the wheel, Devin's words still ringing in his ears. Eric Dawson, a name he had never heard before. A man erased, just like Jessica was being erased now. Someone had been silencing cops for years. Shaq needed to know more, and he knew exactly who to ask. James Porter was a journalist who had built a career on writing about corruption. The kind of man who had more enemies than friends. Shaq found him in a dingy cafe, hunched over a laptop, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Porter barely looked up when Shaq sat across from him. Took you long enough, he muttered. Shaq frowned. You were expecting me? Porter smirked. Shaquille O'Neal accused of police corruption? Come on, man. The minute your name hit the headlines, I knew you'd come looking. Shaq folded his arms. Tell me about Eric Dawson. Porter finally looked at him. Then he closed his laptop and exhaled. Dawson was a detective with LAPD's Organized Crime Task Force. Good cop, one of the best, until he started asking the wrong questions. Shaq waited. Porter leaned in. LAPD had been covering up high-level corruption for years. Dawson found out, started building a case, and then, out of nowhere, he turns up dead in a motel, ruled a suicide. Shaq shook his head. And you think he was murdered? I know he was murdered. Porter sat back. And now they're doing the same thing to Jessica. The only difference? He raised an eyebrow. Now, they've dragged you into it. Shaq's head was spinning. Jessica had been digging into something huge. Dawson had tried before her and ended up dead. Now the same people were setting Shaq up to take the fall. And Devin knew. Shaq stared at his phone, his finger hovering over Devin's contact. Devin had been trying to protect him. Not out of friendship, but out of fear. Shaq had spent his life facing giants. But this was different. This wasn't just a game. This was survival. Shaq had spent his life reading plays before they happened. Basketball was strategy, a game of control. You had to see the whole court, anticipate every move, and counter before your opponent even knew what you were doing. This was no different. The only difference now was that the stakes weren't trophies or contracts. This was survival, and Shaq had no intention of losing. He started with the LAPD leak. James Porter, the journalist, had given him a list of names. Cops Jessica had worked with, officers who might have known what she was investigating before she disappeared. Most of them were dead ends. Either they refused to talk, or they were too scared to say anything. But one name stood out. Officer Kyle Sweeney, a mid-level detective assigned to a department that didn't officially exist, the Special Integrity Task Force. A fancy name for a division that handled things off the record. Sweeney had been in the LAPD for years, but had no major cases tied to his name. No news articles, no press conferences, just a paycheck from the city and a career that existed in the shadows. And Shaq had a gut feeling he was dirty. The plan was simple: trap him. Sweeney was a creature of habit. He hit the same bar every Thursday night, a rundown dive on the outskirts of town, a place where cops drank with gangsters, where everyone had something to hide. Shaq arrived first, slipping into a booth in the corner, pulling his hoodie low over his face. It didn't matter how famous he was, people only saw what they expected to see. And no one expected a millionaire ex-athlete to be sitting alone in a bar like this. Sweeney showed up 15 minutes later, ordering whiskey, drinking like he was trying to forget something. Or someone. Shaq let him settle in before making his move. He pulled out his phone and sent one message. A simple text from an untraceable number. "We need to talk. You're already in too deep." He watched as Sweeney's phone vibrated on the bar top. The cop picked it up, frowning as he read the message. His body tensed. His eyes flicked around the room. Shaq waited. Then he sent the second message. "You think they'll protect you? Ask Jessica Calloway." Sweeney froze. His face went pale. His hands clenched around his glass. Shaq had him. 15 minutes later, Sweeney stumbled out of the bar, heading for his car. His breathing was quick, his hands twitchy. He thought he was being watched. Because he was. Shaq followed at a distance, letting the paranoia build. He knew Sweeney's type, weak under pressure, willing to crack if the right buttons were pushed. When Sweeney reached his car, Shaq made his move. A sharp whistle, just enough to make Sweeney turn. Then, a whisper from the dark. "You want to live?" Sweeney's entire body jerked. His hand shot to his hip, reaching for his gun, but Shaq was already moving. Not toward him, but past him, stepping just into the light. Just enough for Sweeney to see him, and Sweeney's face drained of color. "You..." His voice cracked. "You're supposed to..." Shaq took another step forward, voice low, steady. "Supposed to what? Be locked up? Be ruined?" He let the words sink in. "I'm still here. Jessica isn't. You want to be next?" Sweeney swallowed hard. I don't know anything." Shaq tilted his head. "That's not what I heard. Sweeney's breathing was ragged. "Look, man, Shaq cut him off. "Files." Sweeney blinked. Shaq took another step. "Jessica's case files. I know you have them. You wouldn't be drinking like that if you didn't." Sweeney hesitated. Then, in a barely audible whisper, "They don't exist anymore." Shaq exhaled slowly. There it was. Bullshit. Sweeney shook his head. They were wiped. Her whole investigation was erased. Officially, it never happened. Shaq stared him down. "Then why are you scared?" Sweeney looked away. "Because I made copies." An hour later, Shaq sat in his car, staring at the flash drive in his hand. Sweeney had given it up too easily. Which meant one of two things. Either he was too scared to hold on to it, or he had just handed Shaq his own death sentence. There was only one way to find out. He plugged the drive into his laptop. And everything changed. The files weren't just about Jessica. They weren't just about Eric Dawson. They were about a system. Corrupt officers, fake evidence, names that had been buried, cases that had never been solved because they were never meant to be. And at the center of it all? William Tate. Jessica had been investigating her own boss. And now, Shaq had the proof. But before he could even process what that meant, his phone buzzed. No caller ID. He answered. A voice. Distorted. Mechanical. "You should have let it go." Then, click. Shaq looked up and saw the package sitting outside his front door. He moved carefully, slowly, checking his surroundings before stepping outside. The box was small, unmarked. He picked it up, carried it inside, placed it on the counter, and then, for the first time in his life, his hands shook, because he already knew what was inside. He opened it. And there it was, his old basketball jersey, the one he had worn in high school, drenched in blood. No note, no explanation, just a message, loud and clear. "We know who you are. We know where you came from. We know how to end you." Shaq stared at it, the weight of it pressing down on him. They weren't just threatening him. They were reminding him what he had to lose. He sat in silence for a long time. Then finally, he picked up his phone, dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end was groggy, confused. "Shaq?" Shaq's voice was steady. I need a favor. A pause. Then, must be serious. Shaq looked at the bloody jersey. It is. The sound of pounding fists against the door snapped Shaq awake. Not a knock, a raid. For a split second, he thought he was dreaming. Then the reality crashed in. This was real. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, he could see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting against the glass. LAPD, not just a few officers, an entire unit. Someone was yelling outside. "Shaquille O'Neal, open the door!" Shaq's mind raced. They weren't here to talk. Before he could even reach the front door, it burst open with a deafening crack. They were coming in whether he let them or not. They poured into the penthouse in a wave, tactical gear, weapons drawn. The lead officer, a man with cold eyes and a stiff jaw, held up a warrant. "Mr. O'Neal, you're under investigation for financial fraud and obstruction of justice. We're seizing all digital and physical assets for review." Shaq's voice was steady. "On what grounds?" The officer didn't blink. "Evidence suggests you've been funneling illegal money through your foundation." Shaq's stomach turned. It was a lie. He had spent years building his charity, pouring millions into programs for underprivileged kids. Now, they were twisting his generosity into a weapon against him. He stood there, silent, as they tore through his home, dumping drawers, flipping tables, ripping paintings off the walls as if he had hidden stacks of cash behind them. One officer seized his phone, another removed his laptop. They were wiping him out, systematically, deliberately. And then, just as suddenly as they came, they left. Shaq stood in the wreckage of his home, his reputation, his life, and for the first time, he felt small. By noon, the world had turned on him. Every major news outlet ran the same headline: Shaquille O'Neal under federal investigation. Every network played the same footage: officers storming his penthouse, seizing his assets, dragging his name through the dirt. No one cared about the truth. No one questioned why a beloved philanthropist was suddenly being accused of fraud. Sponsors cut ties. Business partners distanced themselves. Even the people he had helped, the ones who owed him everything, they stayed silent. By evening, Shaq's foundation was shut down, frozen accounts, staff laid off, kids who had depended on his programs, left with nothing. And the message couldn't have been clearer: you should have stayed out of it. Then came the phone call. Nathan Carter, the cyber expert, the only person left in his corner. Shaq answered, his voice hollow. "Tell me you have something." Nathan didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was strained. "James Porter is dead." Shaq's breath caught. "What?" "They found his body an hour ago. Gunshot wound. Ruled a suicide." Shaq's grip tightened around the phone. He knew better. James had been paranoid, careful. He had told Shaq just days ago that he wasn't going anywhere until the truth came out. Now, gone. Erased, just like Jessica, just like Dawson. Shaq stared at the floor, his world spinning. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, all of it was being ripped away. And whoever was pulling the strings, they were winning. That night, Shaq sat alone in his penthouse, the city sprawling below him, the wreckage of his life behind him. His empire was collapsing. His name was a stain in history. And he had no one left to turn to. He had spent years building a life bigger than himself. Now he was watching it burn. And for the first time since this nightmare started, he asked himself a question he never thought he would. Was this the end? Or was this where the real fight began? Shaq stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, looking down at the city. His city. It had given him everything: fame, fortune, respect. And now, it had taken everything away. But what the people dragging his name through the dirt didn't know, he wasn't done yet. Shaq turned back inside, shutting the balcony doors behind him. His penthouse was still a mess from the raid. Papers scattered, furniture overturned, drawers ripped from their hinges. But none of that mattered. Because hidden inside one of the few things the cops hadn't found was his ace, his laptop. And on it, the truth. Weeks ago, when things had first started going sideways, Shaq had taken precautions. He hadn't known exactly what he was dealing with, but he had known someone was after him. So he had done what any man with a target on his back would do. He started recording everything. Every phone call, every meeting, every whispered warning. And now, he had enough to burn the whole system down. The flash drive from Sweeney, the erased case files, the evidence Jessica had gathered, the financial records that showed where the money was really going. Straight to the top. And the name at the center of it all? William Tate. Shaq picked up his phone and dialed Nathan Carter. The hacker picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you're ready." Shaq exhaled. "I'm ready." Nathan was already working on it before Shaq had even called. That was the thing about guys like him. They saw the play before it happened. "I've got everything set up," Nathan said. "Once we hit send, there's no going back." Shaq knew what that meant. The people trying to bury this would not go down quietly. "I don't want this sent to just one place," Shaq said. "I want it everywhere." Nathan chuckled. "Oh, don't worry, big man. This isn't going to be a slow leak. This is a goddamn tsunami." Shaq sat down at his desk, staring at the screen. One click. That's all it would take. One click, and he'd expose a network of corruption that stretched further than anyone imagined. One click, and he'd make himself the most wanted man in America. Shaq took a breath, and then he clicked. Within minutes, the internet exploded. The files spread like wildfire. News agencies, social media, government watchdogs, leaked audio recordings of dirty cops admitting to cover-ups. Bank transactions linking LAPD brass to private security firms that didn't exist. Case files marked as closed, proving officers like Jessica and Eric Dawson had been silenced. And at the top of it all, William Tate, the LAPD's golden boy, the untouchable power, the man running a system built to protect itself. Now, he was exposed. The FBI had no choice. Within hours, they were forced to act. They raided the LAPD headquarters, seized records, pulled in officers for questioning. It was chaos. And just like that, the hunters had become the hunted. But Shaq knew better than to celebrate. Not yet. Because if there was one thing powerful men feared more than the truth, it was losing control. And William Tate? He wasn't going down without a fight. The attack came faster than Shaq expected. It wasn't a public smear campaign. It wasn't another attempt to frame him. It was personal. He was sitting in his penthouse, watching the chaos unfold on TV, when his phone rang. A familiar voice. Devin Brooks. "Shaq," Devin said, his voice tight. "We need to talk." Shaq's gut told him something was wrong. "Talk about what?" A pause. Then, "You're in danger." Shaq tensed. "No kidding." "No," Devin said. "You don't understand. They're coming for you. Tonight." Shaq stood up. "Who?" Silence. Then Devin's voice dropped to a whisper. "The people you pissed off." Shaq hung up and moved fast. He knew what this was. They weren't going to let him walk away. They were going to erase him. He grabbed his laptop, his passport, his emergency bag. He wasn't planning on running forever, but he needed time. He was halfway to the elevator when he heard the door unlock. Shaq froze. He hadn't unlocked it. He turned slowly. And standing in the doorway? Devin, his best friend, his brother. And in his hand? A gun. Shaq stared at him. "Devin." Devin didn't move, didn't speak, and that's when Shaq knew. This wasn't a warning. This was the final move. "You," Shaq said quietly. "It was you all along." Devin's face was unreadable. "Shaq." "You knew," Shaq said, stepping forward. "You knew about Jessica, about Dawson, about all of it." Devin exhaled. "I was trying to protect you." Shaq laughed, but there was no humor in it. "By selling me out?" Devin's grip on the gun tightened. "They told me if I kept you out of it, they'd leave you alone." Shaq's voice was steady. "And you believed them?" Devin didn't answer. "Because they both knew the truth. The system never let you walk away." Shaq took another step forward. "So what now?" Devin swallowed. "They gave me a choice." Shaq waited. Devin's voice was barely a whisper. "Either I end this, or they end me." Shaq exhaled. There it was. The system had always been built like this. Force men like Devon into impossible choices. Make them betray the people they love to survive. And Devon? He was already lost. But Shaq? He wasn't. Devon's hand shook. And Shaq did the only thing he could do. He stepped closer, until the gun was pressed against his chest. And then, in a voice calm and steady, he said, "You don't have to do this." Devon's eyes flickered. Doubt, fear, regret. Then, a crash. The penthouse door burst open. FBI, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon!" Devon's hands shot up. The gun hit the floor. And just like that, it was over. Shaq stood outside hours later, watching as Devon was taken into custody. His oldest friend, his brother, a pawn who had tried to play the game and lost. Shaq closed his eyes. The system had taken so much. But this time, it didn't win. The world moved on faster than Shaq expected. 1 week after the truth was exposed, William Tate was arrested. The FBI found enough evidence to bring down not just him, but a dozen other high-ranking officials, corrupt officers, dirty politicians, and corporate executives who had funded the system for years, all of them taken down in a matter of days. The media, once eager to destroy Shaq, flipped the narrative overnight. Shaquille O'Neal, from suspect to hero. NBA legend exposes police corruption in historic scandal. The same networks that had branded him a criminal now called him a whistleblower. But Shaq didn't feel like a hero. Not after everything he had lost. Devon had taken a plea deal. He avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but his career was over. He had betrayed his best friend, and now he had to live with that. The last time Shaq saw him, Devon couldn't even look him in the eye. Shaq didn't know if he could ever forgive him. Maybe one day. But not today. Jessica, on the other hand, survived. She had been held in a secret medical facility, her records erased, waiting to be eliminated. But when the system collapsed, they had no reason to keep her. She was finally free, and 2 weeks later, she gave birth. Shaq stepped into Jessica's hospital room, unsure of what to say. She looked exhausted, but alive. The baby was asleep in her arms, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Jessica smiled weakly. "Took you long enough." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "I had to make sure you weren't setting me up." She smirked. "I figured you'd say that." Then she carefully adjusted the baby, revealing his tiny face. "I wanted you to meet someone." Shaq looked down at the newborn, his chest tightening. Jessica exhaled. "His name is Shaquille." Shaq's breath caught. He looked at her, searching for words, but none came. Jessica's voice softened. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. My son wouldn't be here." Shaq swallowed hard. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because it was right. And yet, hearing his name given to a child who had barely entered the world, it meant something. Something real. He reached out, gently brushing the baby's tiny hand with his fingertip. "Welcome to the fight, little man." A month later, Shaq stood in front of his foundation. The city had tried to shut it down. The system had tried to destroy it. But now, it was rebuilt. Stronger than before. The grand reopening was packed. Kids, families, community leaders. The people he had always fought for. Someone handed him a microphone, expecting a speech. Shaq looked out at the crowd. He thought about everything it had taken to get here. The people he had lost. The truth he had exposed. The fight that still wasn't over. Because the system hadn't changed. Not yet. But it would. Because as long as he was standing, he would never stop fighting. He looked at the microphone, then set it down. Instead, he turned to the kids watching him, waiting for something profound. And he simply said, "Let's get to work." Because there was still so much more to do. The truth was never meant to come out, but now that it has, what happens next is up to you. Corruption thrives in the shadows. Justice demands those willing to stand in the light. The fight isn't over. The question is, when the next battle comes, where will you stand? Because legends aren't just remembered. They're made.